Start recording. And share the application screen. Can you see on the screen let me call something up here. Can you see the Blackboard homepage?
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. I want to go to the Blackboard homepage first here real quick before we get started with material, because I want to show you guys a little bit of an alteration that we're going through currently to the original course syllabus. This is specifically for the people in the face-to-face class. It doesn't, well, no, I guess actually it's for both. I'm going to look at the short version here. Some of the information obviously is going to be different for the people in the face-to-face class versus the people in the online classes in terms of quiz dates and discussion board dates and so on. But this part of it is the same for both face-to-face and online. You'll recall that in last Tuesday's class meeting, we talked about the United States Congress, and that's consistent with what we had scheduled here for week 10, the topic on the United States Congress. When I was planning the calendar for the semester, I guess it really didn't sink in. I obviously got it here on the syllabus that we had a Thursday holiday, but I guess it really didn't sink in that we didn't have a class session on Thursday. I need 2 class sessions to cover Congress, okay, rather than just one. So we're going to carry over the discussion on Congress today. In today's class meeting, we're going to need 2 class sessions to deal with the presidency. So that means on Thursday, we'll take up the topic on the presidency, but carry that over till next Tuesday, okay? Where we'll catch up is that topic on the bureaucracies, I think. That'll provide us with the opportunity to get back on schedule so that what we're doing in class conforms to what you see here on the syllabus. Yes?
How does that reflect the quizzes?
Well, what it means is that when you come in next week on Tuesday to take the quiz, and for those people online, the week 12 quiz, whichever face-to-face or online, is going to be the same. You're going to see some questions based on the material that we talked about concerning Congress in today's class meeting, and some questions based on what we talk about Thursday on the presidency.
Is that going to be the same for the reading quiz?
No, the reading quizzes we can stay on course as it's indicated here. Yeah. Okay, good question. Anything else you want to ask about? Yeah, I can't really say anything else other than that's my bad, my mistake. I just really wasn't, clearly, when I put this together, I wasn't thinking fully about the implications of that Thursday cancellation. Anyway, we'll get back on track so that we can get through all the topics on the syllabus. And as I said, I think it'll be here when we get to this topic in week 12 next week on the bureaucracies. We can probably just have one class meeting for that a week from Thursday. Okay, well, so let's jump back into the discussion. Anybody else have any questions about something else before we get started? All right, well, let's jump back into the discussion that we were having on Tuesday of last week. We left off talking a little bit about, had just introduced this concept of a veto point to you, okay? You'll remember that one of the themes of last Tuesday's class meeting is simply the idea that we ought not think about Congress as a single point of decision-making authority. We ought not think about it as a unified, integrated decision-making body most of the time. And I think that's a point that I hope I don't want to overemphasize a point and oversimplify things, but I think there's a tendency, particularly given the way that the popular news media covers the legislative process, what Congress does, the headline approach, as I was talking about a week ago, that sort of leaves people with the impression that Congress is a single point of decision-making authority. But the scholars who study Congress, I'm not among them. I'm really just kind of reporting to you based on the literature that I've read what people like Richard Fenno and Randall Ripley and Walter Oleszek and some of the others who spent their careers, studying the United States Congress tell us is that most of the time Congress doesn't operate that way. There are exceptions, but most of the time Congress doesn't operate that way. We ought to think about it in its usual state or its normal state or natural state as being a fragmented body. There is power fragmented in the United States Congress. Congress consists of multiple decision centers, okay? And that's an important theme that we want to continue with today, okay? Again, as I said, I had just introduced to you the concept of a veto point. I had said that everybody knows that the president has a formal veto power under the Constitution, but the president is not the only actor in the legislative process that has an effective veto power. Okay, so you're looking at the screen right now. You see this flow chart of the legislative process, and this is a pretty typical sort of diagram. I think, if I remember correctly, there's probably something pretty similar to this in your textbook, okay, in the chapter on Congress. There is in almost every introductory American government textbook I've ever seen. So I want to go through this process with you, but I want to do it with a little bit different twist. I don't think the authors of textbooks typically do this. I want to go through this process and identify and have us count up the number of veto points, the number of places along the way in the legislative process that a bill can be effectively vetoed. Now, before I continue with that, I have to make absolutely sure I'm comfortable, that you're clear on what I mean by an effective veto point, the distinction between an effective veto point versus a formal veto, right? Again, the president is the only actor in the legislative process that has a formal veto under the Constitution, right? Congress passes legislation, it sends it over to the president, and one of the options that the president has is to sign it into law. The other option is to veto it, in which case, if the president vetoes the bill, it is, most of the time, it's pretty, for all practical purposes, it's a dead matter, right? Congress does have the authority under the Constitution to override a presidential veto, but as some of you probably know, it requires an extraordinary majority, right? It requires a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate to override a president's veto. So that's why very few presidential vetoes are overridden. You just can't muster that many votes most of the time in order to override. There's some classic examples, and maybe we can talk about a couple of them where that has happened, but they're few and far between, right? So that's why I say, as a practical matter, most of the time when the president vetoes legislation, it's dead. Unless Congress wants to, in the next session or some future session, wants to reintroduce the legislation, maybe there's a new president and there's, more of a possibility that the president will sign it, okay? But at least in that session of Congress, the matter is dead, okay? Okay, so again, everybody understands that about the president's formal veto power, but what I'm telling you is that when I say effective veto power, there are actors in the legislative process beyond the president or in addition to the president that have the ability to say no, and it has the effect of a veto, even though there's not a formal veto. Okay, so that's what I mean by that term, effectual veto power, or effective veto power. Okay, so what I want to do again is just sort of run through this process with you, and we're going to identify the veto points and count them up. And hopefully, when we're finished with this process, you'll have a little bit better understanding or a greater appreciation of why it's so difficult for Congress to perform this legislative function. Remember last week we kept saying that of the two major functions that we talked about that Congress has, the representation function and the legislative function, that far and away, at least in the perceptions of most Americans, Congress must do the representative function much better than it does the legislative function, right? Remember how we talked about Fenno's dilemma, right? And the idea that, people think that their individual representative is doing a great job. Well, a great job with what? Representing them, right? Representing what they believe is right or what, they want Congress to do. But where people pretty much give Congress across the board, almost universally, right, low marks where people disapprove is Congress as an institution. And I think that's because when people are asked to evaluate Congress's performance as an institution, they're not thinking about the representation function now. They're thinking about the legislative function. Why can't they do what we send them there to do? You know, we send them there to tackle these difficult problems, and they just sort of engage in this partisan backbiting and, you know, turf battles and whatever it is else it is that people think that Congress does. It's certainly not legislating, right? Many people seem to be convinced. And so that's why we spent all that time last Tuesday talking about how those two functions seem to work against each other to a large extent. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is we're going to talk about a hypothetical bill. Right? Use your imagination. It can be whatever you want it to be. It can be a bill dealing with, you know, an infrastructure plan, let's say, because that's in the news right now. It can be an immigration bill. It can be something very innocuous that most people wouldn't pay attention to. Maybe that's even better. You know, maybe that would be a better example for it. It's some kind of like agricultural policy bill. It's a farm bill, right? Or whatever you want. You use your imagination, right? We're going to trace that, how that works through the legislative process. Now, I think I mentioned this point to you last week. Any bill can be introduced into either chamber of Congress, with one very, very important exception. Who remembers what it is? There's one type of bill that can only be introduced into one of the two chambers. It must be introduced into one of the two chambers first. Who remembers?
Tax bills.
Tax bills. Good. Thank you. Got two people remembered that. Okay. Tax bills. And which chamber must they be introduced into? The House of Representatives. And again, I don't want to cover the same ground that we talked about last time, but I think we talked about this point that that's a remnant of the mentality that the framers of the Constitution had about, you know, going back to the colonial period, this idea, remember the watchwords of the Revolution, right? No taxation without representation, right? They had this idea that no person's property can be taken from him or her. Him, of course, in those days, we would have been talking mainly, you know, with the him pronoun. No person's property can be taken from him without his consent, right? And, you know, that was philosophically the colonist resistance to all that legislation that the British Parliament had passed in the years following the 7 Years' War, the Intolerable Acts, as the Americans referred to them, right? The Sugar Tax and the Stamp Act and all that sort of stuff. So by the time you get to 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, that's still pretty fresh. That's still pretty recent for them. And they had this idea that, well, you know, obviously the national government's going to have to be able to raise taxes, but we want to put that power in the hands of the one body that is directly connected to the people. And that the only body at that time that the people, quote unquote, the people directly elected were members of the United States House of Representatives. Remember, the president wasn't going to be directly elected by the voters. The courts, judges on the federal courts are not going to be elected at all. And originally, members of the United States Senate were not going to be directly elected by voters. They were going to be selected by state legislatures. So that means that the House of Representatives is going to have that taxing power. Okay, so we're talking about something here other than a tax bill. Okay, any other kind of bill can begin either on the House side or the Senate side. And in some circumstances, it is, you know, similar bills go through the House and the Senate simultaneously. Okay, but I can't talk about what happens on the House side and what happens on the Senate side simultaneously. I've never developed that. In all the years I've been doing this, lecturing on the United States Congress, I have never developed the ability to talk about what happens on the House side and the Senate side simultaneously. Okay? So I'm just going to start on the House side. That's my convention. It's the way I have this presentation set up. Okay? So let's imagine that there's some bill introduced into the House of Representatives. Okay? And the first thing that happens to this bill is that it's going to be referred to the appropriate standing committee. After it's logged by the clerk of the House and given a number, you know, House Bill 1232 or whatever it is, right? It is going to be referred to the appropriate full committee. I'm going to resist the temptation to go back to the slide that we looked at last week, but if you were here last week, you remember I briefly put up a slide that had the different types of committees, right? And told you that the authors of the textbook do a really good job with distinguishing among the types of committees, so I didn't feel a real obligation to elaborate on that, except I did want to focus a little bit on the standing committees, because those are the workhorses of the legislative process. That's where most of the work of the legislative process gets done, okay? So remember, there are these full standing committees, and they're organized on what basis? Does anybody remember? So you had something like maybe 24 or 25 of them in the House of Representatives, and then not quite as many in the Senate. Maybe there's like around 20 or 18 or 19 or something like that in the Senate, but they're organized around what?
Categories like village spending, environment, etc.
Yes, so what I would refer to as substantive policy areas. Banking, right? Environmental issues, agricultural issues, whatever the substance is of the bill, it's going to be referred to the committee that has jurisdiction over that area of public policy. So if we're talking about a farm bill, let's go the innocuous route, right? Something that people won't get too fired up about, right? A farm bill, right? Does anybody remember a likely candidate for a House committee that would probably have jurisdiction over that bill? If that's what we're talking about, a hypothetical agricultural policy bill introduced here. There's a full standing committee in the House of Representatives called the House Agriculture Committee, okay, that has jurisdiction over these matters, all right? And then there's a Senate, corresponding Senate committee called the Senate Agriculture, Forestry, and Nutrition Committee, okay? At any rate, whatever the bill deals with, it's going to go to that committee. Now, what options does the full committee have in disposing of that bill? Well, here's several options. I think these are the main options, okay? And again, I'm not an expert on the legislative process, but I think this covers most of the bases, okay? One of the things that the committee can do is just turn that bill right out to the floor. Shoot that bill right out to the floor. That happens, but it's very rare. It's very, very rare for this kind of thing to happen. A bill gets drafted. By the way, I failed to mention this point, so let me go back and throw this in. This is a reasonably important point. Who can introduce a bill into the House of Representatives? I'm not asking you who can come up with the idea for a bill, because that can come from almost anywhere, okay? The question is more narrow, much more narrow. Who can introduce a bill into the House of Representatives? And the answer is only a member of the House of Representatives can introduce a bill. Only a member, they're called the sponsor of the bill. And sometimes you might have more than one sponsor, okay? And sometimes then the bill bears their name, okay? It's popularly known as the McCain-Feingold bill, or whatever the sponsors are, okay? So, it goes to the full committee. Well, it may be sent right out to the floor for floor action, although that's going to rarely happen, okay? Much more likely is that you're going to go through a markup process. That's a technical term that they use in the legislative process. I think the authors of your textbook use that term, the markup process, where amendments are offered to the bill, changes are made to the bill. It is important to note that in the House of Representatives, any amendments offered to the bill must be germane. And that's, again, another technical. There's a lot of vocabulary terms here in this study of the United States Congress. So I'm going to say those two again. We're talking about the process in committee where they mark up a bill, okay, where they offer amendments to the bill. Any amendments that are offered must be germane, G-E-R-M-A-N-E, germane. And that term germane means that the subject matter of the amendment has to be directly related to the subject matter of the original bill. That's an important point, because when we get over to the Senate side, we're going to see that it works differently, that they can offer non-germane amendments in the Senate. So we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes, okay? So that's a much more likely scenario, that you're going to go through this markup process in the committee, okay? The committee might hold hearings, where maybe they call in the Secretary of Agriculture or some deputy secretary or undersecretary to come in and offer testimony on the bill. Or maybe it's an opportunity for interest groups and their lobbyists to come in and testify about the potential effects of this bill. Okay? That's the purpose of the hearings, is to gather information before you take a vote on the bill. Okay? Here's a very important alternative here. In fact, this seems likely in most cases, that with each of these full standing committees, there are a number of subcommittees that are attached. Okay? Let me show you an example here real quick. So what do I have here as an example? I have some Senate committees that I can show you as an example. So here you see the standing subcommittees of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Okay? Whoops. The full committee is called the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then you've got a half dozen subcommittees. And the way they divide that up is by region of the world. So these are going to be people who serve on the African Affairs Subcommittee, are going to be senators who develop some expertise on American foreign policy as it relates to the countries on the continent of Africa. Okay? Over here, you see the full committee called the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And then there are, again, a half dozen subcommittees associated with that, organized around substantive policy issues. Okay? So that's what I mean when I talk about the subcommittees. Okay? So we get back on track this here. So this is a likely scenario that the bill is going to be referred to the subcommittee. Okay? In which case, we have to look at what the subcommittee's options are here in just a second. But before we do that, let me just draw your attention to this last bullet point. All right? It says table the House bill. Okay? Anybody know what that term table means in parliamentary parlance? Have any of you ever been part of an organization that operates according to parliamentary procedure? Have any of you ever watched? Oh, sorry?
Leave it on the table, talk about it next time.
Yeah, technically what happens when a matter is tabled, and in this case we're talking about a legislative matter, a bill. When it's tabled, you're essentially saying, okay, we're going to postpone consideration of this matter until a later time. But in practice, what it really means is that the committee, if it votes to table the bill, it's voting to kill the bill. They're never going to get back to it. And they have no intentions of getting back to it. It's a parliamentary maneuver to dispense with a matter and move on to other business. So we have our first veto point, because the full committee has the option of tabling the bill, which if it tables the bill, it's just dead. It's a dead matter. So there's number one. Okay, now we said that it is likely that the bill will go to the subcommittee in most scenarios. So what are the options that the subcommittee has? Well, they look very similar to what we just outlined. The subcommittee can just turn that bill right back to the full committee. Okay? And notice it says with or without a recommendation. It said that up here too. I kind of glossed over that point, right? The first option here is that the House, the full committee can report the bill out to the House floor with or without a recommendation. With a recommendation that it pass on a floor vote, with a recommendation that it not pass on a floor vote, okay, or with no recommendation at all. And then you get to the subcommittee, and it has a similar option. It can just send that bill back to the full standing committee with a recommendation that it pass, with a recommendation that it not pass, or with no recommendation at all. But again, that is probably not the most likely scenario. That you can go through the amendment process here at the subcommittee level as well. And that is something that happens quite regularly. Okay? And again, the amendments have to be germane. The subcommittee can hold hearings on the bill. And then look at the last one. Again, the subcommittee has the ability to effectively veto this bill by tabling it. So we're up to veto point number 2. But let's assume that the subcommittee does return the bill back to the full committee. Well, then you've got a situation where the full committee has another shot at it, right? Because all those options are still on the table, including tabling the bill. So that's veto point number 3. Full committee, then goes to subcommittee, and then back to full committee. And the full committee has the opportunity at that point to table the bill. So we're up to veto point number 3. Now, if you remember from last Tuesday, I know it was a week ago, but you just took a quiz, and actually this was an item that was questioned on the quiz. What percentage of the bills that are introduced into Congress are ever reported out of committee to the floor for floor action? The answer is less than 10%. So that tells you that the fate of most legislation is to die with one of these first 3 veto points. And that also tells you that the members of the committee, House Committee on Agriculture, are the most important decision makers when it comes to agricultural policy. Or the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is the most important set of actors in the Senate, the corresponding committee in the House, right? That's where the decision-making power is, to a large extent. Let's say against the odds, the full committee reports the bill to the floor. Why do I say against the odds? Well, because less than 10% ever get reported out. So yeah, it's against the odds, right? Before it goes to the floor for floor debate and ultimately a floor vote, in the House of Representatives, there's a stop at the Rules Committee. There's a special committee in the House of Representatives, a permanent standing committee called the Rules Committee, that writes the rules governing floor action, floor debate. And that sounds innocuous enough, except that people who study the United States Congress tell us that this is a very powerful committee in the House of Representatives. It is a coveted committee assignment. If you are elected to the United States House of Representatives and you're assigned to the House Rules Committee, you're a golden boy. You're a golden girl. Somebody thinks that you are it, right? Why is that? What's so important about the Rules Committee? Have any of you ever played a game with someone and along the way you get the idea that they're making up the rules as they go along? That's obviously an over-exaggeration of this case, but the point is that if you've had that experience, you probably can appreciate that the ability to make the rules goes a long way in determining the outcome, who wins and who loses, all right? So the Rules Committee can't table the bill. They don't have the ability to table the bill, but it is possible for the Rules Committee to write rules that are either favorable to the passage of the bill or unfavorable to the passage of the bill. And so I'm going to suggest to you that we need to include the Rules Committee as a veto point. So we're up to number 4. The ability of the Rules Committee to write rules that are either favorable or unfavorable on a floor vote, I think, qualify it as a veto point. Well, eventually we're going to get to this floor action. So you're going to have some debate, and depending on what the Rules Committee said about who's recognized to speak and how much time they recognize. By the way, the rules in the House of Representatives are much more rigid than they are in the Senate. They don't have a filibuster, for example, in the House of Representatives. Back in the 19th century, there was a time when the House did, but the membership of the House is so large that it makes it virtually impossible to have more relaxed debate. The debate has to be more controlled. 435 members can't all speak on a bill, right, on the floor. So eventually you're going to get to this floor vote. We've gotten this far. And what are the 2 possible outcomes? A majority can either vote in favor of it, pass the bill, or vote against it. In which case, if a majority of the House votes against the bill, it's just dead, right? It's a dead matter. So there's a veto point. The floor vote constitutes a veto point. We're up to number 5. Assuming it passes the House on a floor vote, then you go over to the Senate. And we can run through the Senate side a little bit more quickly, right? Because it's essentially the same on the Senate side. There's a couple of exceptions, though, that we need to point out, okay? So the first thing that happens when this bill gets over here to the Senate, it's going to be referred to the full committee. Remember what the committee's options are, but one of them, of course, is the ability to table the bill on the Senate side. The subcommittee has the opportunity to table the bill on the Senate side, and then the full committee has a second opportunity, right? So right there, we've got 3 veto points very quickly that we can identify, number 6, number 7, and number 8, okay? Now, many of you are probably aware of something called the filibuster that they have in it. That's something that's been in the news a lot just since January. The Democrats have an effective majority in the United States Senate because it's a 50-50 split, and any tiebreaker goes to the Vice President of the United States, as you know, which is Kamala Harris, and so she's going to obviously vote the administration's position, the Democrats' position, okay? But regardless of what the split is in the United States Senate, whether it is 50-50 or whether it's 60-40 or any other split, okay, there is, at least up to now, the possibility that an individual senator can kill a bill by using the filibuster. So we could, if we wanted to, add in 100 veto points, because any individual senator, there are 100 senators, right? Any individual senator could veto the bill. But I'm going to resist the temptation to do that. I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind. Talk about power being fragmented in the United States Congress. Consider that an individual senator has the ability to effectively veto a bill by filibustering it. All the talk that you're getting in the news currently about the filibuster and should the filibuster be ended and so on has to do with the way that the filibuster has been used. It used to be that a senator who filibustered a bill actually had to get up, be recognized on the floor, and then just talk and talk and talk until the time ran out that was allotted for consideration of the bill, and that would effectively kill the bill. But more recently, it's just the threat, really more than anything, the threat of a filibuster. That a senator says, well, I'll filibuster that if it comes to the floor. And then, the wheels start turning and people start saying, oh, well, we've got to have, look, to make this really simple, there is an opportunity for the rest of the Senate to end the filibuster. Okay, it's called a cloture vote, C-L-O-T-U-R-E, cloture vote, but it requires 60 senators. And senators are very, very reluctant to invoke cloture. Even senators who are in a majority that want to pass a bill. Again, let me back up here for a second. Let's just explore this for a second. Let me start by getting you to think about why an individual senator, or under what circumstances an individual senator would use a filibuster. There's a couple of things that must be in place, right? One is that the senator knows that if a floor vote is taken on this bill, it's going to what? It's going to pass, and that individual senator doesn't want the bill to pass, right? Now, that doesn't mean anytime an individual senator is in the minority and doesn't want a bill to pass it, they're going to filibuster. They're going to have to be pretty selective about it, right? This is such an important thing to this individual senator that they're willing to use this ability to filibuster to frustrate the will of the majority of senators. You see, as dumb as we like to think members of Congress are, and sometimes they are seem to be pretty, dumb. I didn't used to think that until I I worked for the city of Fort Worth for a while. And at that time, the mayor of the city of Fort Worth, I worked in the city manager's office. I would get called in from time to time to the mayor's office to talk to the mayor, try to straighten the mayor out on this issue or that issue. And I remember, for example, one very interesting conversation I had with her about whether or not renters paid property taxes. And she just really couldn't seem to get the point that I was trying to make to her that, well, sometimes renters do pay property taxes. They may not submit a check to a taxing authority, but economically they pay property taxes. And so I kind of left the office that day under the impression that maybe she wasn't the brightest bulb in the. She was elected to Congress a couple of years later, so maybe there are some members of Congress who aren't, the brightest bulbs, but most of them don't get to where they're at by being dimwits, right? They're leaders of the business community, many of them. They've had successful businesses or successful law practices or whatever. You don't get to that point by being stupid most of the time, okay? Well, one of the things that they can do, if I can get back on track here, is they can count. That's a pretty basic thing that they, for someone to do. And most senators can count. And they can count whether or not there are going to be enough votes to pass this bill that they're so adamantly opposed to. And so if they see that there's enough votes to pass this bill, they may consider a filibuster, right? Now, as I started to say, kind of backed off a little bit, the effect of the filibuster is to kill the bill till we could add in 100 senators as potential veto points. But it is possible for the rest of the Senate to end the filibuster. As I said, it's called a cloture vote, but it takes 60 senators to do it. Right? That's not a simple majority. That's an extraordinary majority. And it's really difficult to get senators, even if you had 75 senators lined up ready to vote for this bill, it might be difficult to get 60 senators to vote in favor of cloture. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think senators might be so reluctant? And we're seeing this debate in Washington right now because they're debating the question of whether or not the Senate should just end the filibuster. And you've got, because the administration, many Democrats, Biden himself hasn't endorsed ending the filibuster. Many Democrats are frustrated because you have Republicans that they believe are obstructing the agenda, right? That are just, thwarting the agenda. And the problem is the filibuster, as they see it, right? So let's end the filibuster, many Democrats say. But there are a few Democrats in the Senate who have publicly said, no, we're not going to do that. Joe Manchin, for example, is among them. As a Democrat, he's never going to vote in favor of ending the filibuster. But in an individual instance in which a senator is filibustering, why might senators be reluctant to end the filibuster?
Because they might think it filibustered by one of their bills.
I think that's exactly it. I think that's the biggest part of the explanation. There may be other things that we could say here as well, but it's probably mainly that they know that they may want to avail themselves of the filibuster someday. And when they use the filibuster, they want their colleagues to respect their filibuster, so they feel obligated to respect, other senators' filibusters. It's a reciprocity thing, right? It's a reciprocation. Okay, so again, we're going to resist that temptation to add in 100 veto points here that we could very reasonably make the argument that we should. Okay? We're going to go to the floor, okay, assuming that it's gotten through these veto points. And again, there's two possible outcomes of a floor vote, pass or fail. And so that's number 9. We're up to 9 veto points. Now, let's say the House passed this agriculture bill, the Senate passed this agriculture bill. Now, what's the next step? On to the president for signature and veto? Or veto? No, not yet, okay? Because most likely the version of the bill that's passed by the Senate is not is not the same version of the bill that was passed by the House of Representatives. Over here, you remember I said that, for example, non-germane amendments can be added. So this bill might deal with an agricultural policy issue, but for whatever reason on the Senate side, they decide to add an amendment dealing with funding for the U.S. Postal Service, which raises all sorts of interesting questions about why senators would do that. So use your imagination. Think about the political calculus. Why might they add a non-germane amendment to a bill? Well, maybe to make the bill less appealing to the president, perhaps, or maybe the House of Representatives, so that they can effectively kill the bill without actually having to vote against the bill. Okay? Or maybe to add something into it that the Senate wants that the majority of the House doesn't want, but there's no other way really to get the House to go along with it. Okay, does that make sense? Those are just two possibilities. All sorts of possibilities why they might add a non-germane amendment, but keep in mind that it is a possibility here. Okay, so it's very, very likely under most circumstances that we have two different versions of the bill. We have a House version of the bill, we have a Senate version of the bill, and remember what the constitutional requirement of bicameralism means for the legislative process. Again, to go back to the quiz that you just took, right? It means that Congress must pass one bill. They can't pass two bills and send them both to the president when the president picks the one he wants. They have to have one bill, okay? So if you've got a House version and a Senate version, then you're going to have a conference committee. A conference committee is composed of members of the House and members of the Senate, and their task is to do what? To hammer out a compromise version of the bill that both the House and the Senate can support. And what are the possible outcomes here? Well, the conference committee can either come up with a compromise version or fail to come up with a compromise version, in which case we have another veto point. Right? The bill can just die right here. But let's assume that a compromise version is reached. Okay, now what? Now on to the president? No, not quite. Okay. All right, can't go to the president just yet, because now we have a third version of the bill. We have the compromise version of the bill, which the House has not voted on, and the Senate has not voted on. So you're going to have to go back to the House and back to the Senate for at least a floor vote, okay? Back to the House and back to the Senate, and again, the possible outcomes are either pass or fail, all right? So we're up to veto points 11 and 12. And then finally, on to the president, assuming that the compromise version is passed by the House and the Senate, then you get to the president for signature or veto, formal veto power here. So we're up to lucky number 13. At a minimum, and I want to emphasize that prepositional phrase, okay? At a minimum, on a typical, on any bill, we are talking about 13 veto points at a minimum. So if you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm starting to get it, now I'm starting to understand why this legislative function is so difficult, why it's so hard for Congress to pass law, we haven't even really gotten started yet, right? Because now I'm going to tell you that depending on the nature of the amendments that are added by the Senate, for example, if non-germane amendments are added, then now you're going to have to bring in whatever Senate and House committees have jurisdiction over that substantive area. My example was a little ridiculous. I said an amendment dealing with funding for the post office. That's probably a poor example, but let's just say for laughs, what committees have jurisdiction in the Senate over postal operations? What committees in the House have jurisdiction over postal? You're going to have to bring those committees in. So you've got veto points there at both the full committee and subcommittee level. Consider that many bills require an appropriation of money. The authors of your textbook make a distinction between an authorization bill and appropriations bill. Okay? An authorization bill is one that gives legal authority to a program to operate. Congress passes this farm bill, giving legal authority to operate this program to benefit farmers, let's say. All right? But the benefit that we're talking about, that we're likely to imagine here, is most likely going to come in the form of a subsidy, right? So money is going to have to be appropriated for that. And that's going to come in the form of an appropriations bill. So now you're going to have to bring in the House Appropriations Committee and subcommittees, the Senate Finance Committee and subcommittees. Consider that many bills have a tax measure associated with them. And if that's the case, you're going to have to bring in the House Ways and Means Committee and subcommittees that are relevant there, and the Senate Finance Committee and subcommittees that are relevant there. Okay? So that by the time you take into consideration appropriations, maybe non-germane amendments, maybe tax measures, and all the things that gets added into the mix along the way, now you're talking about dozens of veto points, right? You're not just talking about 12 or 13. The exact number is really not that important. In fact, I can't give you an exact number. I don't know what the exact number is, but I can tell you it's more than 13, okay? We're probably talking on a typical bill, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of scores, 50, 60, 70 veto points on any given bill. And now you begin to appreciate that notion that it's very, very difficult for Congress to pass legislation. Have any of you ever heard the old adage, I butchered these things up pretty bad, so somebody correct me if I get it wrong. Too many cooks in the kitchen spoils the soup? Have you heard that? What does that mean? Amara, what does that, you think that means, if you've heard that expression before?
I don't know, everything is just a mess, like, it's just compacted.
Imagine a big pot of soup on the stovetop, and your aunt comes in and says, oh, this needs more salt. Huh? And your sister-in-law comes in and says, oh, you need to add, like everybody's putting something in, right? Right? And by the time everybody adds something in or takes something out, whatever, is involved, nobody likes the soup. It's like the worst soup ever, right? That's a pretty ridiculous metaphor, I guess. But I don't know, maybe it's appropriate to what congressional scholars are telling us, right? Here's the way I like to say it more formally. Forget the soup metaphor, okay? In a highly decentralized, fragmented Congress with a multiplicity of decision points, legislative initiatives that are passed usually reflect an attainable consensus rather than a substantive conviction. What does that term, attainable consensus, mean? Like just everyday language, what does that mean? It means what we can get enough people to agree on. Substantive conviction, the belief that something will actually work. You see what that says? That says, in a highly fragmented Congress with a multiplicity of decision centers, legislative matters that are passed usually reflects what we can get enough people to agree on, talking about members of Congress, to agree on, rather than the solution that anyone believes will actually work. I bet if you could get a meeting with President Biden and ask him, is the economic stimulus bill that was recently passed by Congress the version of legislation that you would have passed if you could have done it all on your own? I wonder what he would say. What do you think he would say? Oh, no, that wasn't really what we wrote up or what we proposed or it had a lot of the elements, but, it was watered down. For example, one thing that was watered down really from the word go, if you remember, is that he was promising people a $2,000 stimulus check, and that almost out of the gate was dead on arrival. And so it became $1,400, right? Which cleverly was added to the previous $600 to make it the $2,000 that he promised, right? But the original proposal was, let's be honest about it, was to give people an additional $2,000. But there was no way that was going to pass Congress. And then there was that proposal in there to raise the minimum wage. And that was dead on arrival. That was no way that was passing the Senate. Right? So they had to let that go. Right? So I think if you were to ask President Biden, is that the bill that Congress passed, the bill that Congress passed, is that the bill that you would have written by yourself? I think he would almost certainly say no. And I think the same thing was true, for example, if we can go back to the Trump administration or the Obama administration. The program that we called Obamacare, I guess we still call it that, although it's been pretty much gutted, right? But that program that was passed, authorized by Congress in 2010, a little over a decade ago, that came to be called Obamacare, technically the Affordable Care Act. If we could ask President Obama, former President Obama, is that the version of health care reform that you would have passed if you could have passed it on your own? I'm absolutely certain he would say no. No, that's not what we would have done. But in fact, I remember very clearly, even though it's been over a decade, how blunt President Obama was about it, essentially inviting Republicans to come to the table with their amendments. He said everything's on the table. He recognized going into it that he wasn't going to get everything that he wanted. But I bet even if we asked individual members of Congress, is this the version of economic stimulus that you would have passed if you could have passed it on your own? There's probably none of them that would have said yes, right? Or healthcare reform, or whatever the issue is. Right? So this is, I think, the bottom line. It's what we can get enough members of Congress to agree on, rather than any conviction on the part of anyone that this is the solution that will actually work. I don't mean to suggest to you that what gets done by consensus won't have positive effects. I'm not saying that. It may be that the economic stimulus package does have very positive effects as we move forward, and we'll see those positive effects, not only for individuals, but for the economy in general. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess, until all that kicks in. So I'm not saying that what got passed was garbage, that it has no effect, no positive effect. I'm just saying it's not the version of economic stimulus that Biden would have passed on his own. We don't have a system where a president or a member of Congress or any individual can unilaterally make decisions. Okay, questions, comments? All right, so veto points, that's a concept that's pretty handy, right? It's a pretty simple idea, but it's pretty handy in terms of helping us understand the frustrations of the legislative process. All right, we're quickly running out of time, so let me touch on something here real quick that I think merits our attention. We've spent a lot of time talking about here, talking in the last two class meetings about, the frustrations of the legislative process and why it's so hard for Congress to do the legislative function. I do want to mention to you, though, that there are circumstances that when they're present, they're not as common as the conditions that support fragmentation, but there are conditions that, when they're present, do promote greater unity and integration in Congress. And chiefly among these is the role of political parties. Okay? So I want to start with, let's go back to, I have several sessions of Congress here. I've shared these numbers with you before in a different context when we were talking about the topic on political parties. But, you know, notice here, if we go back to the 113th Congress, this would have been the Congress that met from January of 2013 to January of 2015, okay? Notice that the Republicans had a relatively slim majority in the House of Representatives, and the Democrats had about the same majority in the Senate, okay? And then we go to the 114th Congress, oops, wrong way. We go to the 114th Congress, and you can see that as a result of that election, the Republicans took the majority in the United States Senate as well as the United States House of Representatives. That would have been the Congress that met from January of 2015 to January of 2017. No, am I saying that right? Yeah, January 2015 to January of 2017. So the last 2 years of the Obama administration. The last 2 years that President Obama was in office, he was faced with a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. Okay? And then in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, you can see that the Republicans had slim majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, the first 2 years of the Trump presidency. And then in the last 2 years of the Trump presidency, you can see that the Republicans maintained a slim majority in the Senate, but the Democrats retook the majority in the House of Representatives. Okay? And now we move to the 117th Congress. That's the one that began this January, in January of 2021. And you can see that Democrats have slim majorities in both the House and the Senate. I'm sharing these numbers with you because I want to suggest to you that the role of political parties can be instrumental in advancing a legislative agenda. But it really depends on whether we have unified party government or divided government. Okay? So I want to start with the with the notion of divided government. There's two forms of what political scientists and others refer to as divided government. And the first form of divided government is when you have a president of one party and both chambers of Congress where the opposition party has majorities. So that would be like the example of the last 2 years of the Obama administration. Okay? So the 115th Congress would be an example. The Republicans had slim majorities in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, but you had a Democratic president. A second form of divided government is when, regardless of the party of the president, you have one chamber in which the Republicans have a majority and the other chamber in which the Democrats have a majority. Now, political scientists who study congressional process and this aspect of American government tell us, like my old colleague William Bianco, who's now at the University of Indiana, I believe, last I heard from him. He argues that under either form of divided government, you're unlikely to get major legislative initiatives passed. Don't expect Congress to accomplish much when you have either the first form or the second form of divided government. But it's really the second form of divided government that's most problematic. Okay, it's this form right here. When you have a majority of one party in the House and a majority of the other party in the Senate, regardless of the party of the president. Under that circumstance, he argues, you're not likely to see any significant legislation passed by Congress. And that's exactly what happened in the last 2 years of the Trump presidency. Very little we can point to in the last 2 years of the Trump presidency in terms of legislative initiatives that were passed by Congress. But just like we have as a general proposition, we're more likely to have one of these two forms of divided party government. It's become really the norm in American politics, okay, where we have one of these two forms of divided party government. But there are instances in which, or at least historically have been instances in which, I gotta find the right, hold on, let me find the right place. Clicking on the wrong one. We have unified party government. Okay, so let me start at the end of this here. Okay. Notice here, this graphic shows the 113th Congress. That was the last one that I showed you, the one that I showed you, the least recent one that I showed you there, where the Democrats had a majority in the House, or excuse me, in the Senate, and the Republicans had a majority in the House of Representatives. But go back here to the 111th Congress. Okay, let's see what we have here. Notice that in the 111th Congress, you had the Democrats had 57% of the seats in the Senate, okay, and they had something like 58% of the seats in the House of Representatives. Now, I know it's a long time ago, okay, but you may even remember something that we talked about in this class meeting that was passed by Congress, by this 111th Congress, that some people would say qualifies as a significant legislative accomplishment. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Who would have been president at this time in 2010? Talking about right here. Who was president during this Congress, this 111th Congress? President Obama. Can you think of a significant legislative accomplishment that occurred around 2010? I mentioned it to you earlier. Well, how about the Affordable Care Act, right? Okay. Many analysts would say, well, that qualifies as a significant piece of legislation, okay? But notice that it was possible because the Democrats had comfortable majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay? Wouldn't have gotten Obamacare clearly if there had been divided government. Okay? So the first form of unified party government is where you have a president and both chambers of Congress controlled by the same party, but the majorities in the Congress are slim to moderate majorities. Okay? It's possible, it's at least possible that you could get a significant piece of legislation passed. Less likely you'd get a major legislative agenda passed. Let's go back historically to talk about the second form of unified party government. That's when you have a president of one party and the same party has substantial majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So that's only happened a couple of times in our history. The first period here, it runs here from during the Reconstruction period. Notice that the Republicans had extraordinary majorities, 80%, 75%, 69% majorities during the Reconstruction period. Now we have a topic in a couple of weeks on civil rights, and we're going to talk about what I call the first congressional civil rights agenda, in which significant legislation was passed by the overwhelming Republican majorities in the United States Congress during that Reconstruction period to advance the cause of racial equality and civil rights in this country. You might be shocked when we talk about that by some of the legislation that was passed by them, how progressive it was. Okay? But look what happens. Reconstruction comes to an end with the 44th Congress in 1875, and you go back to the old pattern of divided government, and everything sort of goes back to the status quo. Okay? The second period, see there it is, divided government there in the 44th Congress. Okay? The second period runs from about 1933 to 1939, okay? And there you can see we have in a Democratic president. This was during Franklin Roosevelt's period in office. And you have significant Democratic majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Does anybody remember from your history lessons what we call the significant legislative agenda that was passed during the Roosevelt presidency?
New Deal.
The New Deal. Okay, all that legislation that was passed by Congress. What I'm suggesting to you is that that was only possible really because of the overwhelming Democratic majorities that you had in the House of Representatives. Just like the Reconstruction period legislation from the 1860s and the 1870s was only possible because you had these overwhelming Republican majorities. And then the third period, let me just mention this to you real quick, comes in the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson is president, and you have these overwhelming Democratic majorities that are in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay? Anybody remember what we call the Lyndon Johnson period legislative program?
Civil Rights Act?
Well, Civil Rights Act was one piece of legislation that was passed during this period, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The general term that people used to refer to Lyndon Johnson's legislative agenda was the Great Society. You had all the expansion of welfare programs and civil rights and environmental programs and so on. And again, what I'm telling you is that that would have been possible in a divided Congress or a divided government. These major legislative initiatives are really only possible when you have these overwhelming majorities. Okay, we're out of time. We'll have to just leave it at that and move on to the presidency on Thursday. Okay? We'll see you.